I'm Virginia Murillo, and you're listening to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcast.
Hi, podcasters. Welcome to UC3P, the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts. My name is David Raban, and I'm the incoming production manager for this podcast. Today, we're bringing you a really cool episode. It's with John Prendergast, a human rights and anti-corruption activist who has worked for over 3 decades in Africa. He started nonprofits around investigative journalism and countering genocide and other crimes against humanity. John Prendergast was also the Director of African Affairs on the National Security Council during the Clinton administration. Interviewing Mr. Prendergast is Lauren Manning, a first-year master's student at the Harris School of Public Policy. She's also a fellow with the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflict. Before we get into it, remember to subscribe to UC3P and all of our other podcasts. It's easy. Just go on your smartphone, search on the internet for uc3p.org, click the show, click on your preferred subscription service, and then click subscribe. Again, you're looking for uc3p.org. And with that, let's go. Here's Lauren Manning interviewing John Prendergast.
Hi, I'm Lauren Manning. I am an MPP student here at the University of Chicago. I'm also a fellow with the Pearson Institute. Today we'll be joined by human rights and anti-corruption activist John Prendergast. In late April, he was at the Harris School of Public Policy as a guest speaker with the Master of Arts degree in International Development and Policy program. For over 35 years, Prendergast has focused on the creation and sustainability of peace in Africa. He's the founding director of the Enough Project, an organization aimed at countering genocide and crimes against humanity, and co-founder of the Sentry, an investigative initiative chasing the assets of African war criminals and their international collaborators. He's worked in government, including on peace processes in Ethiopia, Eritrea, Burundi, and Democratic Republic of the Congo, co-authored 11 books, and still finds time to serve as a big brother with the Big Brothers Big Sisters program. Thanks for being with us here today, John.
Thank you, Lauren.
So I'm not going to lie, I'm really excited to be speaking with you today. I was actually a journalism student as an undergrad and had a couple of opportunities to travel to sub-Saharan Africa to report on the experiences of populations affected by conflict and corruption and forced migration. And I've also been following your work for a while because I previously worked in northern Uganda with Invisible Children a few years back, and that was sort of just an opportunity to be thrown into the world of post-conflict reconstruction.
An amazing story. We'll have to sit down and talk about that one.
That sounds great. I'll look forward to that. So one thing that's on my mind a lot is that my journey was sort of accident of ending up in the human rights space. And I'd love to know from you, how did you end up beginning working on issues of conflict and corruption?
I'm equally accidental. I was certain path was to lead me to working with young people in the United States who had left the academic system, had left the school system, and were sort of left behind by society. And one night I was just watching a basketball game, and the game ended, and didn't have a remote control at the time. The televisions in that time, I don't even know if they had remote control by then. And on popped maybe it was an infomercial, maybe it was a documentary, I can't remember now, but it was all about the Ethiopian famine, this famine that was unfolding throughout actually sub-Saharan Africa, but was most acute in Ethiopia because of the war and drought that intersected at the moment. And I could not believe that 1 million people could starve to death. It was just mind-blowing, and I had never seen or heard of anything like it. This is before the internet, so you wouldn't have had these kind of opportunities to have these images bombard you if you were looking for them. And so I decided I've got to at least learn about why this is happening and try to see if there's anything that we as a human race, but particularly we as Americans, because we're the most powerful country in the world, can do something about this. So that's what led me to eventually go to Africa, very shortly thereafter to go to Africa and slowly, steadily find my purpose and my way and my sort of contribution to countering these horrors, these atrocities that have been affecting African populations for not just these last few decades, but centuries.
So fast forward to today, can you tell us a bit about what that journey continues to look like for you?
Yeah, so I kind of bounced around, started in humanitarian work, thinking let's just feed people very innocently, but then realized there was all these roots to the problem. And so then I slowly, steadily got involved in development work, but then saw, well, what about the human rights issue? So I became a human rights sort of investigator. So for years I was working in war zones, doing investigations of human rights abuses and atrocities, mass atrocities in these circumstances. Then I recruited into a government, in this case the Clinton administration, and went to work as a peace negotiator, first in the White House, then at the State Department for President Clinton in Africa, and had success and was part of actually ending wars there. So I saw what the power of the United States could be when motivated properly. And then since my government time, it's really been back to the nonprofit world and learning and seeing, focusing on building constituencies for peace, educating people and understanding what are the root causes of war and how can the United States contribute to making a difference. And that has focused in the last few years on one very specific thing, which is that sort of our belief that the root cause of these ongoing horrific wars is that the governments in these countries have been hijacked by a small cabal of people, military and political and civilian officials, and their commercial collaborators internationally, and they are enriching themselves vast natural resource extraction. And so our role needs to be to follow the money. So we've hired a team of financial forensic investigators to follow the money and say, well, let's go after the money that these war criminals are making on profiting from human misery. Let's go after their international collaborators and the mining companies and the arms dealers and the banks and other places who are making billions of dollars off of this horrific conflict and crisis. And let's create a consequence for the profiting from disaster. And that's what my work is lately.
So with all of that is obviously so much complexity. So something that I find incredibly challenging is thinking about how to translate that information about political situations, about conflict, about corruption to others. And that there's a nuance that can be really overwhelming and where you're trying to strike that balance between demonstrating how significant and serious this is, but not getting people to shut down and think that's too much. There's nothing that I can do to stop that, especially with these high stakes issues. So who are the key audience members for your work that you're trying to reach with this message, and how do you work to translate that depending on what you're hoping that audience will do?
That's a great question. I think our key constituencies, if you will, I think you look at social movements, whether they're national ones here in the United States trying to change some kind of policy here, or social movements that affect situations around the world, students are in the vanguard of almost every one of those. So certainly one of our main targets audience for the kind of work we do is interested student bodies. And we do that. We have all kinds of programs. We have on campuses, so we have campus organizers and all kinds of things all over the United States. So that's one constituency. Second constituency would be faith-based groups. Again, as part of the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the peace movement, anything you want to work on, and you look over the last decades, you're going to have faith-based groups as part and parcel of those efforts. And so we have a lot of connections to Jewish groups, Christian groups, Muslim groups, folks who want to make a difference, who care about human rights. They're a natural constituency. And then thirdly, we ally ourselves with celebrities because they bring eyes to the issues. And we try to find serious folks who are, willing to commit over a course of decades on an issue, and they help shine a spotlight on these issues. And then you do it through books, you do it through movies, you do it through films, you do it through videos, you do it through reports, you do it through speeches, you do it through all kinds of TV shows, radio shows, this podcast, these kinds of things. You just find as many different forums as you can to try to capture people's attention, even if it's just a few people, because we're not, under any illusion. This is not the immigration debate or the healthcare debate. millions and millions of people are at stake over the outcomes. Like if we can walk into the University of Chicago and walk out with 5 people who care a little more than they did before, like that's a major success. So we are humble in terms of what we're trying to do.
So when you share this message with all of these different constituencies that you are speaking to through speaking events, books, research, otherwise, what is your ask to them? What do you want them to do? Besides care a little bit more.
There's usually legislation that is happening at the time that potentially they could encourage their senator or congressperson to co-sponsor. There's often state initiatives focused on some corporate commercial target. There's just learning more. Here are places you can go to sort of become a little better educated. There's ways to engage the companies that our audiences are buying their products from. So we do a lot of work with electronics companies because they're such a dominant industry and their products are driven by raw materials that come from the countries that we work on in East and Central Africa. So having an impact on the supply chain of Apple or Intel or these kinds of electronics companies can have an enormous impact in these countries back. And so, and if they start hearing or they hear from young people who's their principal target for selling their products, then that's going to have an impact. So, usually there's something that folks will have an interest in and that we can plug them into, that they can actually take action and make a difference.
So with that in mind, could you just speak very briefly to the Enough Project and your partner organizations? Because obviously this isn't work that one organization can do alone. And I think that's something that is often underappreciated, is who's working together to get this message out.
The most recent initiative that we've undertaken is called the Sentry, Sentry. Partner in all this is George Clooney, and we realized that if we aren't getting at the core motivation and incentive structure that allows for these wars, these crises to continue, which we think the core issue is the greed, unchecked greed, and the violent extraction and mass looting of the natural resources of these countries. If we don't get at that, then we're just working around the margins. We're working on the symptoms, not the cause. And so we hired a bunch of financial forensic investigators and people who are asset chasers, basically. And teams are going after the finances, the illicit financial flows of the war criminals in Africa and their commercial collaborators in the international system. And so we collect the evidence, build dossiers, turn it over to international banks, turn it over to governments around the world, evidence that they can then take action on. They can actually undertake network sanctions against people. They can undertake anti-money laundering measures. They can freeze them out of banks. Imagine if you had to live your life without a credit card or without access to a bank account or no loans. You'd be hiding your money under your bed. And everybody knows you're hiding your money under bed. So how long is it going to take before your house is broken into? So it's really, it's a significant and serious impact on those folks who are committing war crimes once they are under sanctions, under major sanctions that are enforced. So that's our objective, is to try to freeze these folks out of the international system, to create a serious consequence for the commission of genocide and war crimes, for the use of rape as a tool of war, recruitment of child soldiers, all the different war crimes that we hear about that usually go unpunished.
I was reading something that you wrote recently, and I was really struck by the idea that there's a perception of what a conflict-ridden country is, and it's often thought to be resource poor. And that's something that the broader international community, probably the global community that's not very plugged in, just tends to take it face value. And I was wondering if you could explain that a little bit more regarding the amount of wealth in these places that for the vast majority of the population, people don't realize how that is tied up in these conflict-affected places.
Yeah, let's use just one country to illustrate this. I mean, Congo is sort of the heart of Africa, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And I was researching for a book, and I knew that throughout history there had been some terrible incidents, but I didn't realize the totality of it until I dug in. You go all the way back 500 years. Once the Portuguese landed on the shores of what is present-day Congo, within 5 years they had began kidnapping people and started to export them across the Atlantic Ocean in the transatlantic slave trade. It turned out about a quarter of the enslaved people in the American South during the period of time when slavery existed in the colonies and then in the United States were were from the Congo. So a quarter of the people came from the Congo. And then we, over the course of the next 4 centuries, ivory and rubber and copper and uranium for the bombs in World War II,